Well, good evening. Thank you for joining me tonight for Bible study. We continue to work our way through the story. Um, as always, a reminder, you can find this where books are sold anywhere. I actually saw there were copies of it on eBay the other day for like $3. I am out of copies here at the church, but would be happy to help you get one if you don't have one. Also, I do have some loaded on the church's Kindles, so that would be another way for you to get it is just to borrow the Kindle. And always, as always, you can come in and out of this study. That's, I think, what's partly kind of great about it. I think it's helpful, and part of what I liked about this book, and again, this is just the text of the Bible. There's nothing added to it. There are places where it's sort of abridged and encapsulated, but the text itself is the actual biblical text. But if you stay with it from start to finish, you get a sense of the sort of the arc of the whole narrative of the Bible. And I always say that's part of our challenge when we read and study and use the scriptures, that we have a tendency to take a verse or two here or there, a little bit that helps us, and that's how things get out of context. That's how things get misused and misunderstood. And that's where the Word of God gets lost. To really grasp the Word of God, I think you've got to know the whole of the story, and then the pieces of it make more sense. And I think that you have a little bit more integrity in the way you use them. So anyway, welcome tonight. We are at chapter 5, which is about the covenant. Interesting, great word in the Bible. The word covenant appears 284 times in the Bible. 264 of those times, it's simply translated covenant. In other words, it's a word that defines itself. And so there aren't any really tricky linguistic kind of textual questions to ask about the word. If we're going to understand what the covenant is, we have to understand it within itself. It has multiple layers, and there is much to the word, to be sure. And but to say, well, it's used in one place as a word for treaty or agreement, those few places really don't give us a sense of the whole meaning and how important this idea is. It is a core idea to scriptures, to the understanding of God's relationship with us, with his people. And so when we think about the covenant, we have a lot to think about. So this last half of the book of Exodus, which is kind of where chapter 5 takes us in the book, really is about the arrival of the Israelites, the former slaves, to Sinai, to the mountain there, and that interaction with God and the receiving of his word in that particular kind of way. But it is helpful to remember that this idea of a covenant has been part of the word from the very beginning. It's been part of the story from the very beginning. So in Genesis 9, which is the story of Noah's Ark, already there it is. This is the first appearance of the word covenant in the Bible. So God has defined his relationship with human beings in terms of this word, this idea, covenant, and it will be core. When they arrive at Sinai, it will take on a very specific form, and God will add some content and some reality even to it. But it is an idea that has been a part of the scriptures from the very beginning. Sinai is not the invention of the covenant. It's just its realization in a new form for people who are about to become in a new form as well. The first idea of the covenant, though, is also right here. And I think the central idea, the important idea to the covenant, and that's right here. I am establishing, God says. We often, I think, we get into this mindset, and this is one of those places where we're bringing too much of ourselves into the Bible, where we try to define that relationship with God transactionally. We're good capitalists, and we understand that everything really is about a contract. I make a contract with you. I give you goods or services. You return to me the same value in goods and services, and we have a contractual relationship. And that's the way that we often define our relationships, both in terms of what either party gives and gets. What's important, I think, to know about the word covenant and about the idea of the covenant, and especially about the biblical idea of the covenant, is that it is entirely one-sided. It is something that God has determined to do. It is God's will that creates the covenant. And the Israelites, beginning from Noah through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now with Moses and the people gathered at Sinai, they are drawn into that covenant. They're not invited into it. They're not asked. They don't elect to be a part of it. It is something that God has created and brought his people into. And from there forward, the challenge will be whether the people will live up to the covenant or not. But that's a much different conversation. And that will be, of course, the ongoing conversation through the whole of the Word, is what happens when we do not live up to this covenant that God has created us into. So if we look through the Bible, and we could do this for quite a while, because there are, like, again, multiple dimensions and layers to this idea of covenant, to God's covenant. But I think there are a couple that are kind of worth noting and jumping out at. One is the idea that the covenant is everlasting. That is, it was not created at one time for one group of persons. It's bigger than that. The covenant is at the essence of who God is. And so when he talks, for example, in Ezekiel, I will remember my covenant with you. In the days of your youth, I will establish with you an everlasting covenant. Right? That it is bigger than any other moment. That it is something that has been a part of God from the beginning. And I would dare say something wired into the creation itself. That this notion of God creating a covenant is part of the purpose of the creation and why the creation happens. And it is, of course, the fulfillment of the creation. And it is the fulfillment of us, that we should live in this covenant and live out this covenant with God at all times. This very particular kind of relationship really defines us and defines the world. And so in that case, it's not just one thing among many, not one relationship we have among many, not one aspect of our relationship with God among many. It is the whole of our relationship with God. It is the whole of us, and it exists for the whole of time. There's always that conversation between what some scholars like to call the first covenant and the second covenant. You know, the first covenant with the people of the Hebrew Bible, and then this new covenant that comes in Jesus. The coming of Jesus is just simply another dimension to the whole covenant that God has established with his people through all of time. And it's not a change. It's not a new creation in the sense that it's different or it changes or supersedes the previous covenant. It is the manifestation of the covenant just simply in a new way. Just simply in a new way. Secondly, there are signs to the covenant. An emotion or matter of the heart. It has a physical reality. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, again, it's here, right? It's in this act of circumcision. It's in this way of the people, that first community of faith, marking themselves in this very particular way. As we move forward through time, as we come into the time of the Christian church, that particular physical sign is not something we've decided is necessary, determined as necessary for us to be in the covenant. And Paul talks about circumcision in new kind of ways now, a circumcision of the heart even. Right? But it never lets go of the fact that the covenant is not just a thought or a hope. It is a reality, and it lives in the things that we do and in the way that we are and in the people that we are. And in a little bit here, as we get into the laws, which is part of the Mount Sinai story, those all exist as ways to create signs of the covenant. I mean, and when we can get our head around it in those terms, then we see them in much different ways. What seems clear to me as I read through, especially through the Pentateuch and through those early notions of the covenant, is that all of that is to create the Israelites, to create the community of faith as a different people from the rest of the world. It is to make God's people stand out in the world, to make us different and unique. And now that uniqueness shows in different ways. When we are people who work for justice and peace, when we stand with those whom no one will stand with, when we live lives of grace and hope and bring joy into the world. That is how we become a sign of the covenant. And in the reality of our actions, not just our words, but our deeds, those are the signs of the covenant for the world. And those are the things that make known to the world that we are part of this covenant that God has established with all of the creation. The covenant is renewable. The covenant cannot be broken. I know that's not necessarily an easy thing for people to hear, but in the sense that the covenant is God's creation and God's work, nothing that we can do would overcome God's work. That seems simple and logical enough. There are times throughout all of the Bible, and there are still times going on every single day, when we do not live up to the covenant, and when we disregard the covenant, or do not follow through on it, or do not make it manifest. But in all of those times, the covenant is never gone from us. This relationship that God has started with us is always there, and when we fall away, God always makes it brand new again. God always draws us back into this relationship. It's not unlike a relationship in a family. You can say that you've left your family. You can say that you've estranged yourself or divorced yourself from your family. But those ties are always there. Those connections are never lost fully. And there's always a hope of renewal. So especially again through the prophets now, this language. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. God is going to renew his covenant, going to bring it back to life. I think we want to be careful with this idea of it being a new covenant, as if something is going to change about it. It's going to be new is that God is going to re-bring his people back into that relationship. The expectations, the word of God, that never changes. What's new is us. What becomes new is the people with whom God makes that covenant. And that's when it seems new, a brand new, renewed relationship. Think of it as a couple renewing their wedding vows after decades of marriage. And they're not building a new marriage, right? They are simply breathing new life into what has always been. And so when we talk about renewing the covenant, that's the kind of thought process we want to have. And somehow we're going to breathe new life into this everlasting, eternal relationship that God has made with his creation from the beginning. So we really can't talk about Torah, and especially, of course, when here we are now with Moses and the people on the Mount of Sinai, without talking about Torah. And Torah is, what comes first to your mind when you hear the word Torah, I'm sure, as all of us do, especially Christians, is we think about the Torah as this collection of laws, of commandments, of rules, right? These are the things that determine the covenant. These are the things that we have to do to live up to the covenant. This is the Torah. That's a horrible translation of the word Torah. Really what it means is teaching, or I think better, instruction. Or you could even translate it as guidance. There are 631 different commandments in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible. 631 different rules and regulations guiding everything from dress codes to how to wash your hands, to what to eat, to relationships, to legal squabbles between people, to how to live with the land, and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. It's amazing, in fact, how detailed it can be at certain points and times. But if we only see those as 631 different rules that we have to follow, there's no hope for us. Right? I mean, I hope that you understand that. If that's all there is to Torah, is there are a bunch of rules, then we will always be outside the covenant. We will always have fallen short of the promise. We will never have any hope of living it out. One other thing that kind of helps to really get a handle on what the Torah is to understand that it exists as an oral tradition too. It's not just a bunch of things written on a piece of paper or carved in a bit of stone. That for the Israelites, and you see it among the rabbis now, teaching the Torah is far more than just reading the words of those 5 books of the Bible. The Torah lives on in the Talmud, and and in the Midrash. So if you and I were to go and study the Torah and to come to try to come to understand it and to be good students of the Torah, we would have a book. And in that book, there would be one column in the center, and it would have the words of the actual first 5 books of the Bible, those words from Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Then there would be columns around that same columns that would have the words of other scholars and rabbis from centuries and centuries ago, commenting on, extrapolating about, making an expansion of what does that mean? What does that say? So, for example, we might read in the Bible, in the Torah, about the rules concerning divorce and how a man can divorce his wife by writing her a certificate of divorce and handing it to her. And then the rabbis would then ask, well, what does that mean? Under what circumstances would a man be permitted to do that? Does that mean that under anything, if she burns his toast in the morning, is that an acceptable reason for a man to divorce his wife? And another rabbi would say, no, that can only be done under the circumstance of adultery. And it is that back and forth, that give and take, that living out of the Torah that brings those words to life and makes the covenant a living relationship. Not just a bunch of words carved in stone, but an actual living, breathing organism that keeps us alive and keeps our relationship with God alive. Right? And so, as Christians, we have a similar tradition to that called binding and loosing, which is based on this notion, based on these words of Jesus here in Matthew 18, and you see them in other places. He says, truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. These are Jesus' instructions to Peter and the disciple after Peter's great confession that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. And this is the foundation of what it means to be the Church of Jesus Christ. That is, we are the community of faith in which we consider the words of God's law and bind or loose them upon one another for the sake of living out the covenant in our time. Now, suppose I were to read to you some of those 631 different laws in the books of the Bible. I'll read a couple of these are just even out of the book of Leviticus. Right? This is chapter 11, verse 7. The pig, even though it has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed, it does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you. In other words, the eating of pork, as I think probably most of us know, is strictly prohibited, biblically speaking. That means no bacon, no ham, no sausage, no pork products of any kind. It also goes on to say, by the way, in these eating restrictions, anything in the seas or in the streams that does not have fins or scales, or of the swarming creatures in the waters, among the other living things that are in the waters, these are detestable to you. In other words, no shellfish, no shrimp, no lobster, no clams. All of those things are strictly prohibited by the Bible. It says, when you reap the harvest of the land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. In other words, when you go out to harvest your crop, always leave a portion of it unharvested to allow poor people to come and pick that for their own needs. Imagine taking that and expanding that to the idea that you should never keep all of the profits of your business, but simply leave some of the cash on the street. Or perhaps you're a manufacturer. Never sell all of the things that you manufacture, but just leave some of those products out on the streets for poor people to come and get as they need, right? You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. Right? Pay everyone, all your workers, exactly at the end of the day. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. You shall not put on a garment made of 2 different materials. So all of you who own a Labradoodle, you are working now against the Bible, right? If you're wearing poly-cotton blend clothing, you are in violation of the words of the Bible. You shall not round off the hair of your temples or mar the edges of your beard. Well, last Friday I trimmed my beard and I violated the scriptures. This is a favorite of mine. When an alien resides in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you are aliens in the land of Egypt. That idea appears 36 different times in the first 5 books of the Bible. It is constant throughout the whole of the Torah. It is an unbreakable rule of God that when we build walls on our borders, we break. And it goes on. The priest shall not go anywhere where there is a dead body. I was wondering, then how do you do a funeral if you can't go where there's a dead body? And it goes on and it goes more. Oh, there's one more that you'll love. If any of your kin fall into difficulty and become dependent on you, you shall support them. They shall live with you as though they were resident aliens. So if you have a brother-in-law who needs to live on your couch, you have to do it. You can't say no. Right? Imagine trying to keep all of those rules. Obviously, throughout all of history, the Christian church has done this work. We have bound and loosed certain rules upon ourselves. So we allow the eating of pork products, or the wearing of certain clothes, or any number of things that are obviously against the words of the Bible, but we have determined that they are not necessarily binding on us as followers of Jesus. This is how we do what rabbis do in the Midrash. Right? This is that very same work. And this is great work and ongoing work because it reminds us again that the covenant we have with God that takes shape in the form of the Torah is a living relationship that we are called to constantly examine and re-examine and make be that thing that is a sign in the world of how we are part of God's covenant. Couple last quick things. The 10 Commandments, of course, are the first things that come off of the Mount Sinai, the first words that come out of Moses' mouth. Right? You know them well, hopefully. If you don't know them well, you should know them well. It is interesting that Luther, this is kind of the standard form of them. Luther did not include this as part of his commandments. He thought carved images were really more a part of the commandment against idolatry, the first commandment, and so then he split the 10th into 2 different commandments. I think that's an interesting conversation that we ought to have, and I think that's a quirk to Luther. I think you can kind of go both ways with that as well. But again, I put 10 in parentheses here because there is one point I want to make. These are the 10 Commandments because they're the first 10. When Moses comes down the mountain from the first time, you read it in Exodus chapter 20. As soon as he finishes this 10, he starts writing on a whole bunch more. There is nothing in the Bible that says, okay, here are the 10 really important commandments, and the rest are just a lot of stuff. These take a general shape, and in many ways are great tools to shape and understand the whole of the Torah, and the whole of the Word of God, and the whole of the covenant. But it is a human invention that they stand by themselves and takes such specific kind of force among us. That in itself is not a particularly biblical idea. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that's how it is. But I got thinking about Luther's Small Catechism and the way he teaches the 10 Commandments. And there are a couple of ideas that you capture when you study the Small Catechism and how he teaches the commandments that I think are pretty helpful just in this larger conversation about how we interact with the Word, specifically with the words of the Torah, with the words of the Pentateuch, with these hundreds and hundreds of laws and rules, and how we make those an actual living part of our spiritual life, and not just a whole bunch of stuff that we have to memorize and follow whether we want to or not. The first is that when Luther approaches the commandments, he always asks the question, what does this mean? Not, what does this say? What does this mean? When God says, thou shalt not murder, what does he mean by that? What does that apply? When I find later in the Torah rules that prescribe the death of someone because of the breaking of some commandment or some rule or some law, then how does this all fit together? Understanding again that there is more to the covenant than just the words of the law. Secondly, he starts them all with this phrase that we should fear and love God. Not that we should just, okay, here are a bunch of rules and you should be afraid because if you break too many of them, you're going to the hot place. right? But living in this intersection between fearing God, that is, not wanting to break the covenant, respecting this gift that God has given us so much that we want to be, desperately want to be the people we are made to be, the people that God created us to be, wants us to be. At the same time that this is an act of love, right? That this is also a gift that God has given us, these rules, these laws, this covenant. They are there to make our lives better. And so, for example, when you read the kosher restrictions, the eating restrictions, perhaps there's something in there that helps us think that, you know what, maybe I should be more thoughtful about the things I put in my body. Maybe I should take better care of myself and just not eat things because I want to. It doesn't have to boil down to the specific things, because in that general concept, if I believe that these words are a gift from God, a gift of love, and I love the God who gave them to me, then maybe I could see some new things and get some new ideas and find some new ways so that the Torah could be a sign of God's grace and a sign of my love of Him. The other thing that I really love about the Small Catechism is that it always has these words. When Luther reads the commands, he starts with the thou shalt not part, thou shalt not kill. In other words, you should not harm your neighbor in any kind of way. And then he always has a second half. But you should watch out for your neighbor's well-being and care and protect him. Right? So that there is always both a negative and a positive aspect to the law. It's not just a bunch of prohibitions. It's also an opportunity for us to be better. Not just that we shouldn't steal things that don't belong to us, but we should also help our neighbor protect what belongs to him and watch over his beings. And it goes on and on like that. And so I really encourage you to spend a little time with Luther's Catechism, because these three ideas are a great tool to just unwrap the whole of this the whole of these 5 books, the whole of all of this material, which at first seems cumbersome, and at first seems just weighty and impossible. But when we understand that it is a sign of this relationship we have with God, it is a gift for our well-being and a way for us to live out grace in our lives and in the world, well, there is a whole lot more to it than just a bunch of rules and laws. I hope that you enjoy this chapter as well. I think it has a lot of interesting stuff. I'm always want to caution people, if they want to read in its entirety these parts of the Bible, I think that's well worth doing. But I want to be sure that we always go into it with this right sort of mindset. We have this proper kind of stance as we go through this material, so that we can get the good that is in it, because it is, like I said, extraordinarily detailed and can be very weighty as well. But enjoy your reading and your studying. As always, if you have comments or questions, you can reach out to me directly or use the comment section on the Facebook page to put your thoughts and ideas there. You take care, and we will see you again next Wednesday.